We are continuing our study in the book of Revelation. We are in chapter 13. Chapter 13 will be dealing with the beast that arises out of the sea and another beast that's going to arise out of the earth. So, when I was putting this together, I was like, oh, this is so tough to do. I'm going to try to present this as coherently as possible. But for many, the way that I'm trying to present it has probably never been presented this way before, and so I will probably still be grappling with, oh, should I have done it this way, and I may have to revise it in the future as I try to string along a couple chapters together. We're just going to be dealing with the first verse of chapter 13 today, and then we'll come back and maybe I'll readjust it a little bit, and we'll move into verse 2 of chapter 13. We're still doing somewhat of a word study, but I'm trying to do more conceptual at this point. All right, so let's get started here. Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." So this is John continuing his visions and revelations that the Lord is showing him. He's saying, "I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his head the name of blasphemy." Wow, that's a lot. All right, so we'll just start here. It says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea." So this is John standing upon the sand of the sea. So the question may be, well, where is he standing at upon the sand of what sea, right? So the book of Revelation, its perspective or focal point is from the nation of Israel, right? And this phrase, the sand of the sea, is quite common, right? It's actually talking about the shores of Israel. And this beast that is rising out of the sea, the purpose of this beast is ultimately to come upon the land of Israel, to overtake the land of Israel, to bring destruction of the land of Israel and the saints, right, that are in Israel during the tribulation period, right? So that's where John's perspective is. When he's saying he's standing on the sand of the sea, he's talking about he's standing upon the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel has an ocean bordering it, right? It has a sea bordering it. So he's standing upon the sands of the nation of Israel, upon their shoreline, and he's seeing the beast finally rising up to try to overtake the nation of Israel. Now, this has always been the purpose of the beast throughout time, and we've seen that when we read chapter 12. So it's a continuation of the same concept of how the beast with the 7 heads was always trying to attack Israel, this woman, the nation of Israel, and this woman that finally brought the perfection of faith on earth, manifesting Christ, right? This beast was always trying to attack this woman, right? And so here we see that's why when it's saying stand upon the sand of the sea, this is John standing upon the homeland of the nation of Israel, on the shores of Israel, looking out upon the sea where the beast is always trying to come and attack the nation of Israel. Now we know this because when we look at Genesis chapter 33, verse 17, we see this familiar phrase as well of when Abraham was called to walk, and wherever he was going to walk, he was going to be blessed, and that land will become, by covenant, all of the land that will be given to the nation of Israel. Of course, we know that's what Christ is going to bring into fulfillment when he comes at his second coming. All of the land that Abraham walked upon, God is going to give that to Christ as part of his kingdom for the nation of Israel. But in Genesis chapter 33, verse 17, it says that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, which we already know that was talking about the spiritual seed, those that were part of those of us who come into Christ, right? We are, by faith, children of Abraham, right? And as the sand which is upon the seashore. So here we see this sand here. And that sand that he's talking about, that is the natural nation of Israel, right? That's the nation of Israel, which the lineage that came forth from Abraham. That's that sand. And so this is that sand that's on the seashore that John is talking about. That's where he's standing upon. He's standing upon the nation of Israel, along the whole sands representing the nation of Israel from a perspective of the nation of Israel, and looking out and seeing the sea where the beast is rising up that wants to destroy them. And he begins to describe that beast with 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name blasphemy. Right, so The beast that we're talking about here, it says a beast is what we're talking about. So we're talking about there is a specific beast. You know it's going to be a kingdom. You know this also involves a person. It also involves Satan as well. It's all bundled up into this beast that finally rises up. They all come together to make this a beast, like this identified beast that's going to come during the Great Tribulation period. And this beast here, when you look this word up, is called Therion. Right? It means a voracious beast of prey. Now, we've been reading about other beasts that's been in the book of Revelation, especially in the earlier chapters. There were 4 beasts that was around the throne. When you look up that word, it's not the same word for beast as we see here, the beast rising up out of the ocean, right, getting ready to encroach and come upon the land of Israel. That beast that's around the throne, which we said had the face like an eagle and a man and a lion and a calf or something like that, or an ox, right? That beast, when you look that word up, that's Zoe. It means a living creature, an animal. All right, so it's different kinds of beasts here, and I just want to separate that out just for those who are just into word study and things like that, to know that we're talking about 2 different types of that beast that we're talking about. Is not a voracious, murderous, killing animal. It's one that worships God. It's a living creature that God created that worships God and things like that. But of course, it's a symbol of Christ, right? So when we know when it says, I stood upon the sand of the sea, we know the sea is talking about, that's the Gentile nations, the Gentile world, groups of various types of people that are out in the world, specifically the Gentiles, right? And so it says that, he goes on, he says, I saw the beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns. All right, we'll get to the blasphemy part later. So the 7 heads, we have talked about this before, the 7 heads represents the 7 kingdoms that have been throughout humanity, right? When you go back and look at Revelation chapter 17, verse 9, it gives, and I put the quote of that line there, it says, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. So as we later get to the end part of the book of Revelation, it's going to talk about this same beast again, and it's going to give clarity to John. Christ is going to give him interpretation of what the 7 heads represent, right? And he says the 7 heads represent 7 mountains, and mountains, as we said before, represents kingdoms. So the 7 heads that this beast has that rises up out of the sea represents the 7 kingdoms, right? And so then it says then that there are 10 horns, right? Now we're talking about this one beast that rises up is going to have all of the features of all of the nations, world kingdoms of the past. All 7 kingdoms. That's why this beast is going to eventually called, is more diverse than the beast that came before it, right? Because it's going to possess all of the attributes of all 7 kingdoms, and that goes back to Egypt, Syria, and it goes back to well, we'll discuss what all those different 7 kingdoms are. But this beast that rises up, it's going to have all of the attributes, both of their military, cultural, and also spiritual aspects as well. That's why sodomy, it says, Jerusalem is called like Sodom and Egypt, because this beast is more diverse than all of them, meaning that it has all of the aspects of all the kingdoms that have risen before are combined into this one beast at the time of the Great Tribulation period, when the Antichrist rises on the scene and the people are worshiping the dragon. It's going to pull all of those features in together. It's going to be a beast that's going to be diverse in all, having all of these features. Like we said, it has Sodom and Gomorrah, and Egypt is what Jerusalem was called back during the tribulation period. Right. So, but these 10 horns represent 10 kings that have power and authority. All right. So that's what the horn represents power and authority. But the horn also represents 10 kings that have power and authority. We know that because, again, the book of Revelation, chapter 17, provides us an interpretation of the symbols of what the 10 horns mean. And when you read that, Revelation chapter 17, verse 12, it says, 10 horns which thou seest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Now, when John was first getting these different, believe it or not, there are even within the book of Revelation, this beast that we're describing has small nuances or minutiae or differences that you may not pick up on, but we're going to try to show you this. But we see in Revelation chapter 17, um, the Spirit or John is being told here in Revelation chapter 17 that this beast is going to come with 7 heads and 10 horns, but they haven't received 1 hour. They haven't received power as kings 1 hour with the beast yet. So what's it saying? That later on he's going to describe this beast again, but he's going to say this beast has not arrived yet, but it will arrive, and when it arrives, it will receive power 1 hour. Each of these kings will receive 1 hour of power and authority with the beast. When the beast does arrive in the tribulation period with these 10 kings, we know that it is the beast of the Antichrist spirit during the tribulation period, because they will have power as king 1 hour with the beast, and that is symbolized by having the uh, horns with 10 crowns. So when it says here there are 7 heads and has 10 horns, and then upon his horns 10 crowns, that phrase horns and then upon his horns 10 crowns, that means that this is that beast that rises up in the great tribulation period, that reigns with the Antichrist and Satan, that now reign. Those 10 kings now have power, and that power is those 10 crowns. This crown here is different than the crown that the 20 and 4 elders that sit around the throne, they have a crown, right? When you go and look up the 2 words, they have different meanings. The crowns that the 20 and 4 elders have, and that we have as well when we're up in heaven, that's a crown for, like, if you run a race and you run the race righteously or properly, you're given this crown, but that crown is a crown of what's the proper word, of victory. It's a crown of victory, that you run the race and you run it well. It's not the type of crown of like a crown of like you reign and rule with power, although Christ is going to give us power and authority. But that crown that we have is awarded to victors, right? In the book of John, I was talking about overcoming, being victorious. He that overcometh, believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and all those things he talks about. And Jesus talks about, if you do these things, I will give you a crown. That's talking about that you've done things properly, fairly, you've run the race according to how it's supposed to be done in the measure of Christ. But this crown that we're talking about is a different one. It talks about power to reign and to rule and to dominate, right? These 10 kings during the Great Tribulation period that rise up with the Antichrist and Satan, they are going to have great power to reign. They're going to dominate. They're going to rule. And we're starting to see that happen now. We're starting to see the spirit of the Antichrist rising up, preparing the way where in Australia, they're telling people you can only come out for 2 hours, right? They are being brutal. They're telling people, I can show you videos of them saying that you have to wear a mask and you're not allowed to come out. When you do come out, you can't talk to people in the grocery stores. You can't talk to friends. You have to keep yourself isolated. They are executing authority and power. And we're seeing that in Paris and France and all these other places. They are being brutal with the type of lockdowns and forces and enforcement of certain things as well. But that's nothing compared to what in the last days during the Great Tribulation period, what these 10 kings are going to be able to do when they are finally given a crown by Satan to dominate and bring the people into submission as they work under the Antichrist. Or they are beginning to prepare the work for the Antichrist, because it says the 10 horns are present, and then rises up the little horn, right, and kills off the 3. So these 10 crowns or 10 kings that are given power, they help prepare and set the groundwork for the rising up of the Antichrist to then take it all over. But they're responsible for helping to dominate, bring the domination and submission of the whole world to prepare the way for this Antichrist that comes up. So we're going to go back and we're going to read, we're going to see this same beast that's going to have 7 heads and 10 horns, but it will not say upon those 10 horns have 10 crowns. That means it is not yet that beast that's going to be present during the Great Tribulation period. But it is the progression of that system is in place, but not yet the one that's going to rise up during the Great Tribulation period, right? So what we're seeing, what we're reading here in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, that I'm referencing, verse 9 and verse 12, it's talking about the beast that is to come, but it's not yet that actual beast. The actual beast that is going to come during the Great Tribulation period is the one we're talking about right now in chapter 17. So in chapter 12, it talks about the beast rising up, what chapter we just read, having 7 horns and 7 heads and 10 horns, but it doesn't talk about the crown. The one we're talking about here in Revelation chapter 17 talks about the beast rising up having 7 heads and 10 horns, but it doesn't mention the crown yet either, because it is speaking of the one that is speaking of a beast system that is in progression, but the actual one has not yet to come to fully rule and reign with the Antichrist yet. Right? We'll show that out a little more. So when you see the phrase "upon his horns 10 crowns," that means that's the actual Antichrist beast system with Satan and the Antichrist. That's the, I'm gonna say, the Antichrist kingdom, with the Antichrist being present and with Satan in his full force operating through all those modalities. The kingdom of the Antichrist system, called the beast, the Antichrist, who is called the beast, and Satan that works, gives his power to both the false prophet, which is called the beast, and gives his power to the Antichrist system kingdom, and Satan gives his power to the Antichrist. So when you see upon his head 10 horns with 10 crowns, you know you're talking about the Antichrist beast system, right? The fulfillment of the beast of the Great Tribulation period, when you see that the kings possess, I'm just rephrasing it, the 10 horns with 10 crowns, that means they're actually reigning for that 1 hour duration it talks about, as they're given 1 hour to reign with the beast. It's only 1 hour because it's just a short time period. It's just a few years, or should I say, 3.5 years. So that's why it's just called 1 hour. That 1 hour is talking about they just get 3.5 years to reign, and that's it. Let's look at the example. Let's look at an example we see in Daniel chapter 7, verse 2 through 7. It says, Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen the 4 winds of the heaven. We read 4 winds of the heaven back in Revelation chapter 7, and we read about it. We elaborated on what those 4 winds were in Revelation chapter 8 as well. But what Daniel was seeing here is the prophecy of the beast system coming and the judgment that's going to be coming upon the beast system and the great sea, or the great sea represents all of the Gentile nations of the world that come together, that bring forth, that usher in the great beast system of the Antichrist. It's already in progress now, but it continues throughout the time of humanity until its greatest fulfillment, as we're reading now in Revelation chapter 13. But when Daniel was seeing the prophecy of this great beast coming, he's also seeing how the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And the strove meaning that it's fighting. There's a fight and a judgment is coming upon them. I'll read Revelation chapter 7, verse 1. It talks about this. It says, and after these things, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor any tree. Now we know that was part of the angels were holding back the 4 corners, or holding back the 4 winds, so that he could seal the 144,000 Jews that would go out and preach the gospel. Well, this 4 winds that we just read in Revelation chapter 7, Daniel seeing that as part of his prophecy of the coming of the beast system, right, or this great Antichrist system coming. So the judgment that is coming upon the world, that judgment has already been proclaimed. Daniel seeing that. The proclamation of judgment is coming with the rise of the Antichrist system, the rise of these 7 nations that have been pushing forth the Antichrist, the mystery of iniquity, the persecution of Israel, the destruction of the saints. Daniel saw the proclamation of judgment that comes with the rising of the coming together of the world Gentile nations to bring forth this Antichrist system, to bring persecution upon the saints and upon Israel, he saw that judgment proclamation coming upon the beast system and the nations of the world. He saw that, and then he goes on into the rest of the prophecy. We know that those four winds are talking about the first, second, and third and fourth angels that sound the trumpet. Those are the judgments that are going to be proclaimed against um, the world as they participate in it's called the seven trumpets of judgments that these angels are holding, right? That are proclaimed against the Gentile nation and the Antichrist as they rise up to begin to persecute and to kill and destroy the saints and stuff like that and worship Satan. So Daniel was already seeing that proclamation of judgment that's coming as these nations rise up together under the authority of Satan, right? So that's what those four winds represent, and we discussed that in a previous in chapter 7 when we went over the book of Revelation. He goes on, verse 2 of Daniel chapter 7 says, and four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings, and I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Behold, another beast, a second, like a bear, and it raised itself up on one side, and it had three ribs in its mouth of it between the teeth of it, and they said thus unto it, arise and devour much flesh. And after this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl. The beast had also four heads, and dominion was given to it. All right, so these represent these four beasts that Daniel was seeing here represents part of the seven heads that the beast that is arising in the last day during the Great Tribulation period is going to possess. He's going to possess the features that the lion, the bear, and the leopard have. This beast is going to have these features as well, as Daniel is describing it. We're not going to go into any more detail more than that, right? And then verse 7 continues. It says, and after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, and exceedingly and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth, and it devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Right, so this fourth beast that's going to rise up, which what we're talking about now in the book of Revelation chapter 13, that fourth beast is going to have teeth like an iron, right? It's going to be diverse then from all the other beasts before it, because it's going to have all of the features of all the other beasts that came before it. And when we say diverse from all the other beasts, it means it's going to have all seven kingdoms that ever existed. It's going to possess all of that, including the three that Daniel just mentioned here in Daniel chapter 7. So it's going to include, Babylon. It's going to include Persia. It's going to include Greece, but it's also going to include Egypt and Assyria as well, right? So that's why it's going to be more diverse than all of it. But he focuses on that it had teeth like a great iron, and we know iron is that symbol that represents Rome. But we know we're talking about that fourth and final beast because it says it has the 10 horns. So he never mentioned the first beast or the second beast or the third beast that had 10 horns, but he did mention that fourth beast had those 10 horns. And so we know those 10 horns represent those kings that are going to rise and have power with the beast for 1 hour, right? But notice here that it doesn't say that this fourth beast has 10 horns with 10 crowns. So this beast that Daniel is talking about, he's seeing it coming, but it is not actually the Antichrist beast that is going to rise up in the Great Tribulation period, because it does not have the 10 horns with 10 crowns yet. So the crowns have not yet come, right? We all know that this fourth beast that's going to rise up during the Great Tribulation period is going to represent a revived Second Roman Empire, right? The revived Second Roman Empire is going to have the 10 horns with 10 crowns when it rises up in the time of the Great Tribulation period. So when you look at what Daniel wrote, Daniel presents the kingdoms and order in which they occur chronologically going forward in time. He presents the lion, which represents Babylon. He presents the bear, which represents Persia. He presents the leopard, which represents Greece. And then he presents this fourth dreadful and terrible beast, which represents Rome, right? But later on, it's going to represent, when he talks about it has the 10 horns with 10 crowns, with the crowns on it, that's representing the revived Rome, what I call Rome 2, that occurs during the Great Tribulation period. I don't know if I'm making sense or not. My wife was, I don't know. It's a lot sometimes. I know that. All right. Now, when you read the book of John puts it in reverse order, right? Because he's looking back in time, putting it all together. Daniel is looking forward in time. And that's one thing that when you study prophecy a lot, you have to look at prophecy occurs, I said, it occurs vertically. Prophecies they deal with prophecy that occurs both in heaven, that occurs on earth, and then occurs in the spiritual realm. So like when we read in the book of Revelation chapter 12, prophecy started out talking about there was war in heaven, right? That prophecy occurs in heaven, applies to heaven. And the same prophecy was then talking about, and there was war. And later on in the book of Revelation chapter 12, and this time there was war and Satan was cast to the earth. So that's talking about the same prophecy of war occurring in heaven, war occurring on earth. So prophecy occurs vertical, and then there's war that occurs in the heavenly places, things like that, within like the kingdom of heaven. All right, so prophecies occur vertically at multiple levels. Prophecies occur cyclical, we've talked about, that repeats over and over. And then prophecy also occurs forward and backwards. And I didn't always know this, but with time, I began to recognize that prophecy looks forward, prophecy looks back. And that's how I was able to determine some things about what we're talking about when Jesus was talking about the end times, the end of the world. Certain things will be happening. And I was showing you how one time he's looking forward, the other time he's starting from a midpoint and he's looking backwards, and people confuse the two and they don't understand. And so they think one is a rapture when it's not, it's not talking about a rapture, things like that. So we talked about that before when we looked at some things in Luke dealing with prophecies about the end times. Right, so prophecy is some things you have to be important to understand, because you can get a lot of things confused if you don't understand the perspective. Right, so here when John, he's saying it in reverse order. He talks about the fourth and dreadful and terrible beast, right? When he's describing this beast that rises out of the sea, right? Then he just talked about the leopard, and then he talks about the bear, and then he talks about the lion. This is the complete reverse order that Daniel talks about, because John is looking back in prophecy, or Daniel's looking forward. Right. Daniel, unfortunately, he only includes 4 kingdoms. Only 4 kingdoms are mentioned in the book of Daniel. He excludes Egypt and Assyria. But when we look at the beast that's described in the book of Revelation, he describes it as a 7-headed beast. John only talked about 4 beasts, right? Here, John talks about a 7-headed beast, which represents 7 kingdoms. So John includes Egypt, the 7 heads referring to Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And then that second one that makes it the 7th head is what I call Rome 2, the revised Rome. But this revised Rome is going to have all of the features of all other kingdoms that have preceded it, all bound together. Right, it's going to have elements of Egypt, elements of Syria, elements of Babylon, elements of Persia, elements of Greece, and the Roman Empire as well. That's what makes Rome 2, or this beast that John is talking about in Revelation chapter 13. That's what he's seeing. He's seeing the one that is the combination of all kingdoms and all their perversion, all combined into get all their military might, all of their idolatry, perversion, violence, murder, all of it, from everything from the beginning of humanity, and its evilness and idolatry all the way up to where we're at today. So all the pagan things that were going on in times past in Babylon and in Persia and in Egypt, all that's going to be back. And we see it rising up now. Like all this pagan stuff I was preaching, speaking, sharing last week, and I was showing them all these different types of tattoos and piercings that people have and stuff like that. Like all that stuff is going way back to ancient um, civilizations and how they did things. And that spirit is rising up and it's coming back. Right. So when it talks about the 7 heads and the 10 horns, right, uh, that's talking about the diversity of this 4th kingdom that's right, or that the final kingdom that's going to be present during the Great Tribulation period. And its diversity is talking about all those 7 kingdoms united together. And when it talks about the 10 horns with the 10 crowns, that means you're specifically talking about that final and last kingdom that comes up with the Antichrist, where the 10 horns are actually now are crowned to have authority with the Antichrist. Right? So that's what John's revealing to us in Revelation chapter 13. And to show you that difference, when you look back at Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, right, it does talk about this beast system that we're talking about here. But remember I said when we're reading Revelation chapter 12, it's showing us chronology in time. Right? So in Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 and 3, it starts out, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. Now notice this is almost similar to what we just read in chapter 13. We just went 1 chapter forward, and now it's describing this beast here as having 7 heads, which we know, yes, it has 7 heads. What are those 7 heads we talked about before? Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, right, Rome, and then the revised Rome, I'm calling Rome 2. Right, so when he's talking about these 7 heads, he's talking about that all of these kingdoms are now pretty much present, right? Rome is present already, but it's going to be revived again in a different way, but it's Rome, right? And then he mentions there are 10 horns, right? So he's talking about, okay, there are 10 kings, but these 10 kings don't have 10 crowns on them yet. But he does say the 7 heads have crowns on them, right? So that means that these are kingdoms that have come and have had authority and power. And it says all 7 of them have had authority and power. And that includes the Roman Empire. Of course, we know the Roman Empire did not fall, and it will be revived again. And so it's still considered part of that 7 because it's already present, it has already reigned, and it will be revived and it will reign again. But the 10 horns, we notice here, does not have 10 crowns yet because it's early in the process of chronology of time. The chronology of time that we're seeing here is with the coming of the birth of Christ. So the system is already in place, right? When the coming of the birth of Christ came, these 7 kingdoms have already been in place. They've already had authority, right? But these 10 horns have not yet risen on the scene yet to have been crowned with a crown to have power and authority yet. So that hasn't been fulfilled yet. So that's what is in process waiting when we read Revelation chapter 12, as we see here, right? And so those murderous kingdoms are already present, and the 7 heads already been crowned, and they're already present upon the scene. Even when Christ arrived, they were already present, and that was pretty much it. Right, but the 10 horns are not yet having their 10 crowns yet because it's not yet the Great Tribulation period. Those 10 horns, those 10 kings being crowned yet, they only rise up during the Great Tribulation period, as we're now reading in chapter 13. So when we look at Revelation chapter 17 again, Daniel is receiving revelation of how to interpret this 7-headed beast, right, with these 10 crowns, with these 10 horns and things like that. He's given an interpretation, right? And we read it here in Revelation chapter 17, verse 10. It says, and there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. So what is it saying? That we know that it says 5 are fallen. So from John's lifetime, the five that have fallen are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece. Those are the five that has fallen. When he says, when the revelation interpretation says, and one is, the one that is during John's lifetime. That's Rome. Rome is the one that is. That is what I'm going to call Rome 1. Presently reigning during John's life and present when Christ was on earth at his first coming, walking as the Son of Man. And then it says, the other is not yet come. So the other that is not yet come is what we're actually reading here in Revelation chapter 13. That's the one that is come that we're talking about now. But during John's time, it has not yet come, right? And that's the one that we call that fourth, dreadful and terrible, diverse than all others, because it's going to have all the combination of all of them. We call that I'm calling it the revived Roman Empire 2, but it really is that Antichrist beast system and kingdom that he shares with, or reigns through the power of Satan and with the false prophet, that second beast. All right, so when you continue reading book of Revelation chapter 17, verse 11, it says, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seventh and goeth into perdition. This sounds very confusing. It says, and the beast that was and is not. What is the beast that was and it is not, but it is also of the seventh? So we know that there are 7 kingdoms, right? Because he says it is of the 7. So the 7 kingdoms are Egypt, which we know Egypt still exists today. There is an Egypt. It's over there. I want to go there and visit it. There is a Babylon. Babylon is still here. Babylon is still here. There is a Persia. Persia is still here, right? I think we call that Iran, I believe. Yeah, I think we call it, because we call Iraq is what we call modern day Babylon, right? And there currently is a Greece, and there currently is Rome. But what most people don't understand, that Assyria has totally been eradicated. There is no Assyria that exists today. You cannot say, oh, well, there is Assyria over there. Assyria does not exist. So when we talk about of the 7, the beast that was and is not, that's really, I believe, talking about Assyria. Now, today, believe it or not, Assyrians do exist. And I was looking it up with my wife not too long ago. One of the largest populations of Assyrians, they call themselves Assyrians. They have Assyrian identity. They have Assyrian language and Assyrian culture. Actually, is in San Francisco. I think it's 150,000 of them in San Francisco. But they also, if you go and Google it or Wikipedia it, you'll find there are actual Assyrians that hold on to their culture. Mother Edward sent a question to me, and I'll respond to that. There are actually groups of people call themselves Assyrians, and they hold on to their nation, to their national identity. So Assyrians, and they are looking for the return of their nation, right? And that's what the caliphate is all about. I don't know if you guys understand what's going on. The caliphate that was trying to be set up by ISIS, they're basically trying to reestablish what Assyria was, right? The last caliphate was the Ottoman Empire, which was established in Turkey, and that's what we're going to talk about. How we're going to show that the Antichrist is going to come from Turkey. All right, we're going to look at a whole bunch of scriptures. It's going to show that the Antichrist is going to come from Turkey. Is going to be called the Assyrian. The Bible calls him the Assyrian, right? But anyway, so this is when I look at this here, when we talk about the 7 that exist, and it says the beast system, or this beast that was and is not, and then he is the 8th and is of the 7th. He has come from the 7th, right? And the 7th already exists here, but the one that is not yet presently was, but is not currently, is Assyria. Assyria does not exist. But Assyria has to be reformed again. And a lot of this politics that we see going on, we look at what's going on there in Afghanistan and ISIS and all this stuff. People are looking for the caliphate to come back. They're looking for the revived Assyrian Empire, right? The last one was the Ottoman Empire, which was part of the Roman Empire. It was that second leg of the Roman Empire. And the second leg of the Roman Empire that was reestablished in Constantinople, over in Turkey, that lasted 1,000 years longer when the Roman Empire fell over in Rome. It extended for another 1,000 years. That has to return. That Ottoman Caliphate Empire has to return, and we're going to see that begin to form again at some point. All right. This Muslim empire is going to rise up again and make itself known. And that's this politics that we see going on in the world today. But anyway, I don't want to get too much off topic because my time is it's getting thin here. All right. So when he's talking about also, oh, I see, Mother, show me the text here. Mother Edwards sent me a text. Her question was, or she made a comment to everyone. Does the 7 beast system being one, or are they separate as a symbolic of one another separately? The ultimate goal that Satan has is for all of these individual nations to be, they all represent a collective work together. There are individual nations that have a spirit driving behind them, a purpose behind them. And the goal, of course, was to capture, destroy Israel, destroy the saints, prevent the word of God from coming forth, prevent Christ from coming forth. It is both a spiritual system, a nation system of control and dominance and reign. It's individual, but it's all group part of the same thing. But now initially we're seeing them as individual nations. We say, Babylon rose and fall, Egypt rose and fall, Syria rose and fall, Persia rose and fell, Greece rose and fell, Rome rose and fell. We see them separately, but to Satan, they're all part of the same system. They're all working together. And in the last day, the vision that has always been shown to us that all of these are part of the same work of Satan. It's all part of his same body of work, and he's able to bring them all together in the last day during the great empire system to be unified back together as one, working together. All right. He's going to use all the different forces that he had individually in these nations, bring them all together collectively as one system, ruling as one nation, one power by one man. And when he does it like that, it can never be defeated. Takes the best of everything symbolically and puts it all together into one. But this has been his entire goal from the beginning, right? Satan sees the whole picture. We only saw as humanity only sees it as individual nations and systems and things like that. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but all right.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. So as well as this thing that talks about, and the beast that was and is not, and even he is the 8th and is of the 7th and goeth into perdition. This is also talking about the Antichrist, right? The Antichrist, he represents, most people don't understand that the Antichrist is the 11th horn. We talk about there's 10 horns, 10 kings. But from the 10 kings arises another horn, it says. There are 10 horns and then arises another horn. So the Antichrist actually is the 11th horn that rises up. We know that he kills 3 of the 10 kings, leaving 7 remaining. But then the scripture says he becomes the 8th. There's 7 that remain, and he is the 8th one. He is the 8th. So you have to tie in, when he becomes the 8th, the system that he operates in becomes a totally new kind of kingdom as well. When he becomes the 8th, right? When it says and he becomes the 8th, but is of the 7th. When he says he's of the 7th, he works in conjunction with this beast that we're talking about. The 8th is both a kingdom. It is also includes a man who is the 8th, and in being the 8th, he also sets up a new type of kingdom. But he's also of the 7th. Of the 7th, meaning he's also arises from the 7-head system. He's a part of that 7-head system, right? Which I believe is Assyria. He is of the 7th, which he rises out of the 7 nations or 7 kingdoms that pre-existed, which is going to, I believe, going to be Assyria. And then it says, and he goes into perdition. This going into perdition, that how he becomes the eighth is that Satan enters into him. When Satan enters into him, he goes into perdition. And that's how he becomes the eighth. The eighth is a symbol of a new beginning, something that has never happened before. So there's a man coming on the scene that rises up, takes power. He's able to destroy other men, but he's not like any other men. Once Satan enters in him, he established something that's totally new, a new beginning of a new type of reign, a man filled with the power and authority of Satan. That's the eighth, right? But he is of the seventh. But when he becomes the eighth and embodied by Satan, he goes into perdition, right? That means so. Right, and that's what it was said about Judas. Satan entered into him, and he entered into perdition. In Luke chapter 22, verse 3, it says, "Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being of the number of the 12." So he's one of the 12 apostles, and Satan entered into him. And we know the scriptures talks about how he entered. Judas entered into perdition as well. Right, he entered into perdition. That means that Satan entered into him and caused him to be the Antichrist, to be of like the Antichrist spirit, to fight against Christ, to try to destroy Christ, right, bring Christ down and low and stuff like that, right? But Satan, he is also the eighth as well. So this sounds crazy that this beast that we're talking about, right, having the 7 heads, right, or the 7 kingdoms, all of that is Satan. That's his work of art. That's his body of work. So he is also the eighth. So there are 7 kingdoms, and he's the eighth of that. That's him. He's part of that. He's the one that's holding it all up, that's building it. He's the one that's going to eventually also reign through it as well with the Antichrist. So he is also the eighth, right? I know this may sound really crazy. He reigns over all of it as his own kingdom. Like that's he becomes the eighth. He sets up an 8th kingdom. He becomes the 8th ruler over all of this as well. I don't know. It may sound confusing. You guys can ask me questions on this later. That's my time here to help me kind of revise and to make this a little more clear as I am trying to put this together. All right, I'm going to stop right here. Comments or questions?